The fight for Kenyan land was met with empire's brutality. They spilled blood over tea and then buried the truth in silence. But the land remembers, and so do the people. Subscribe for Episode 5, Germany in Namibia Genocide Before the Holocaust. Like, comment, and share to expose the forgotten crimes of empire. Thank you for your support. Let's go back to our story. For decades, the official narrative of the British Empire has been carefully curated, often omitting the darker chapters of its colonial past. Today, we pull back that veil to expose a brutal truth: Britain's violent suppression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. This is a story of land, labor, and the ruthless tactics employed to maintain an empire. It is a narrative steeped in conflict, where the fight for freedom was met with unimaginable cruelty. We will uncover the systematic use of torture, widespread executions, and the establishment of concentration camps. This is not merely history, it is an investigation into a war for freedom that Britain desperately tried to bury. The truth reveals land stolen, blood spilled, and the empire's tea-stained hands. This is the hidden history of Kenya, a testament to the enduring legacy of colonial violence. The seeds of rebellion were sown long before the first shot was fired, rooted deeply in the fertile soil of Kenya. In the early 1900s, British settlers began a systematic land grab, seizing vast tracts of the most productive land. This was the ancestral home of the Kikuyu people, who had cultivated these lands for generations. The rich Kenyan highlands, once communal and life-sustaining, were forcibly converted into sprawling tea and coffee plantations. This act of dispossession displaced hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu people from their traditional territories. They were rendered landless in their own homeland. Stripped of their livelihoods, many Africans were then forced into labor on these very plantations. They toiled under harsh conditions, often for meager wages on land that was once theirs. Adding insult to injury, they were subjected to heavy taxation, further entrenching their economic subjugation. Political representation was non-existent, denying Kenyans any voice in their own governance. The colonial administration brazenly referred to native Kenyans as squatters on their own land, a chilling testament to the profound injustice. It was a stark reality. The sun never set on the British Empire, but for the African farmer, it often felt as though it never truly rose. The simmering resentment finally erupted into open conflict between 1952 and 1960, marking the Mau Mau Uprising. This was a desperate and courageous challenge to entrenched colonial rule, a fight for dignity and self-determination. The Mau Mau fighters were not terrorists, as the British propaganda machine claimed. They were freedom fighters. The rebellion was primarily led by members of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru communities. They rose up against the systemic injustices that had plagued their lives for decades. Their demands were clear: an end to land seizure, an end to forced labor, and an end to the oppressive colonial system. The British response was swift and brutal. A state of emergency was declared, unleashing the full might of the colonial state. Mass arrests became commonplace, with thousands of Kenyans rounded up and detained without trial. The colonial forces employed scorched earth tactics, destroying villages and crops. Curfews were enforced, and entire communities were subjected to forced relocation and imprisonment in fortified villages. The British narrative painted the Mau Mau as savage and barbaric, but history reveals a different truth. These were people fighting for their fundamental rights against an overwhelming, oppressive power. The true horror of Britain's war in Kenya unfolded within the confines of its detention camps. These were not mere holding facilities, they were sites of systematic abuse and unimaginable suffering. Over 1.5 million Kenyans, a staggering number, were forcibly detained in these camps during the emergency. Within these barbed wire enclosures, widespread torture became a routine instrument of control. Accounts detail horrific acts including castration, sexual violence, and deliberate starvation. The aim is not just to extract information, but to break the spirit of an entire population. Operation Anvil in 1954 exemplified this brutality, involving a complete lockdown of Nairobi and mass roundups of its African residents. Thousands were swept into the camps, their lives irrevocably altered. The British government was acutely aware of these atrocities. To conceal the scale of their crimes, a deliberate policy of destroying records was implemented. These migrated archives were either burned or secretly shipped back to Britain, an attempt to erase the evidence before decolonization. These were not detention centers, they were death camps. In 2013, after years of legal battles, the UK government paid £19.9 million in compensation to 5,228 victims. This payment, while a small acknowledgement, barely scratches the surface of the suffering. Historians estimate that tens of thousands, if not more, died or disappeared within these camps, their fates still unknown. The echoes of Britain's dirty war in Kenya resonate deeply in the present day. The vast tea plantations, established on stolen land, continue to dominate the Kenyan highlands. Multinational corporations like Unilever and James Finley still hold significant sway over these lucrative agricultural enterprises. The land originally seized during the colonial era remains largely in corporate hands, perpetuating a cycle of dispossession. This unresolved issue of land ownership continues to be a source of tension and inequality in modern Kenya. The legacy of colonial exploitation is not a distant memory, it is a lived reality. Generational trauma afflicts the descendants of those who endured the detention camps. The psychological scars of torture, loss, and displacement have been passed down through families. Many former detainees, now elderly, continue to live in abject poverty, their lives shattered by the colonial experience. Their pleas for justice and reparations often go unheard. Meanwhile, in Britain, the history of the Mau Mau rebellion is frequently whitewashed or entirely omitted from school curricula and mainstream media. The British left, but their plantations and the injustices they represent remained. The fight for Kenyan land was met with the empire's most brutal response. Britain spilled blood over tea, then attempted to bury the truth in silence. They sought to erase the memory of their atrocities, to sanitize their colonial past. But the land remembers, and so do the people. The stories of the Mau Mau, of the detention camps, and of the enduring struggle for justice must not be forgotten. It is our collective responsibility to ensure these truths are brought to light. We must remember the past, not to dwell in bitterness, but to understand the present and shape a more just future. Share this story, discuss its implications, and demand accountability for historical injustices. In our next episode, we will delve into another forgotten chapter of colonial violence, Germany's brutal genocide in Namibia. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share this video to help us expose the forgotten crimes of empire and ensure that history in its rawest form is never silenced. Thank you for watching. See you in the next adventure.